Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Blackbaud, the world's leading cloud software company powering social good. With their cloud solution for higher education, Blackbaud connects thousands of campuses worldwide. Visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn how they can help your institution deliver a better experience. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thanks, David. Our guest today is Martin Leifeld, author, consultant, coach, public speaker, and fundraiser extraordinaire. Martin has had a long and distinguished career in fundraising with Christian and secular organizations, over 24 years, and he and his teams have raised over $500 million for multiple causes, but primarily in the higher education areas. Martin joined us from his home in St. Louis, where he, like most of us, are sheltering in place, and he discussed how fundraising is changing, but even more so during the coronavirus crisis. Martin, welcome back to the show. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Drum. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Gosh, I was looking up earlier today. You were my fourth podcast that I ever did.
Well, that makes it all the more unexplainable why you'd have me back.
Oh, you and I both know that that's not true. But, it's great to see you again and to be able to catch up.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to see you, Drum, and glad to see that you're continuing to make a great contribution to the greater good through your work and your talents.
You're very kind, sir. Likewise. Now, we're going to talk, because we're in very different times than when we had you on the show about a year and a half ago. Coronavirus, obviously, is many challenges going on. Your specific area is fundraising and leadership. And before we came on, we were chatting a little bit about some parallels and experiences that you had back in the Great Recession with fundraising. And you thought that might help inform some of our conversation today. So if you wouldn't mind sharing those with us, that'd be great.
Happy to do so. I've been having a number of conversations with a number of folks in the nonprofit world and certainly in the higher education lane. And this story has seemed to, be encouraging to people. And I'm drawing encouragement from it. And I think there's a lot of lessons embedded within the story. So I appreciate your teeing it up in this way. Beginning of August 2008, I began what turned out to be 10 years as vice chancellor for university advancement at the University of Missouri St. Louis, which is a public land grant institution, urban land grant here in St. Louis, and responsible for virtually all the external dimensions of the institution on behalf of the chancellor. When I arrived, a 7-year campaign was underway, and the first 3 years, which was silent years, as they say, quiet years, had been completed by my predecessor. And it was a young institution at the time, older now, but in its early 40s when I arrived. And I was to take it public in my first year. The goal was 100 million. Seemed achievable as I was interviewing for the job. But in September, more or less a month later, the economic world of ours collapsed. And we had the Great Recession landing with this incredible thud. And Drum, you're old enough like myself to remember that feeling. And we were all kind of shell-shocked by it. It felt overwhelming. We watched on television, not dissimilar to today, leader after leader, fumbling and going, putting in 24-hour days, day after day after day, trying to cope, trying to come up with a plan, because it wasn't pure and simple. It was just phenomenally complex and impacting the entire world. not just here in the USA and not just you and me in our lives. And back then, I was still settling into the position and, working as hard and as smart as I could. And I was talking to peers and, a number of entities were suspending campaigns. Others that had been about ready to launch campaigns decided to hold off. And, this made a lot of sense, I think, for them because, people were feeling so financially insecure. And it was such a confidence hit, let's say, to the psyche of those like ourselves who had resources and who had, had success in accruing resources over time. And it was in that kind of, I wasn't hired to recommend to the chancellor to put the thing on ice. And that's not my nature anyway, to be honest, Drum. So I was, scouting about, as I said, and I ran into this article. And in this article, a fellow named Robert F. Sharp, fantastic consultant, nonprofit consultant in the southeastern United States, was quoted. And what he was quoted as saying is that there were some organizations in the Great Depression, with a D, depression, that raised more funds than before the Great Depression. Well, I mean, that was like the skies opened, the sun shined down on me, and I said, we're going to go ahead and make this thing happen. And we got busy. We worked furiously. We engaged with, donor after donor, prospect after prospect. Now, that fiscal year began July 1st, so I came in a month into that fiscal year, and it ended June 30th. And during that 2008-2009 year, we raised 54% more than the previous year, which was 54% more than any year in the history of the university. And this was in, arguably the worst year since the Great Depression. So, folks, first of all, my advice is don't stop what you're doing, but don't ignore the context in which we're working in. So it's so important that we stay focused on the basics in the sense of what are the basics? Well, the basics are we represent outstanding organizations that have missions that are important to humanity, to the advancement of the world. So we have these honorable roles, these strategically very important roles, and organizations that are adding terrific value to the world in which we live in. We can't forget that.
So that's a great point. We do have a higher purpose for what we do in higher ed. And as I recall from the previous podcast that we did, it's about the relationships that you form. One of the things that I've seen very effective, and I'd like you to comment on this, is during these times, it takes more effort to build those relationships, but in some cases, those relationships become more enduring because you're really giving of yourself and you're being authentic in what you're trying to do. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. You're absolutely on target. It is all about relationships. So we begin with this notion that, we have this very important role. We're about helping to accomplish great good with the organizations with whom we are associated, with who may be very well employing us. And then we look outwards from that. And what do we really have? We have relationships and potential relationships. I believe, and you've heard me say this before, Drum, that if you can boil life down to the very basics, it's relationship. We're in relationship with others, and we have a relationship with ourselves. That's a lifetime of self-understanding and growing and developing of ourselves. But we have all of these relationships and potential relationships. That doesn't change when there's an economic collapse. It doesn't change when there's a virus that's impacting the whole world. We have this set of relationships and potential relationships. So when we have a long view about relationships, what we're really thinking about is the lifetime of the donor, the lifetime of the relationship. And that transcends, because we're probably, this earth, this planet's going to outlast the coronavirus. Humanity ultimately will live beyond it. We may live differently, perceive reality differently by the time we come on the other side of it, but we will do that in concert with others in relationships. Secondly, because someone has their bank account, their stocks and bonds, their other investments take a hit, it doesn't mean that their value system has taken a hit. Quite the opposite. What tends to happen in times of crisis is one's values crystallize or reclarify, right? It's like the light shines on them. Why? Because we're stopped short. It's a full stop, and it causes us to consider what matters most. Mm-hmm. And this is the same with those who, if you're philanthropic, you don't say, well, now that I've got 25% less in the market, I'm no longer going to be philanthropic. No. Mm-hmm. Philanthropic motivations are far more fundamental and deeper than that. So when we look out from who we are and what we represent, and we look at our relationships, we don't have to fear those relationships. In fact, what happens is oftentimes those relationships, which we represent, become more precious for those relationships that we are privileged to enjoy, right? Because our value actually grows in its estimation rather than lowers in its estimation, because we're a part of what matters most as people rethink about who they are and their circumstances in light of this, shock to their systems. So this is the great opportunity, and there's always opportunity in difficulties, right? We always have an opportunity to learn, to grow, to change, and to help others to do the same. And so we have this opportunity to engage with our relationships, and that can include fundraising. But fundamentally, it begins with, how are you doing? How are your circumstances? How are your relationships? Mm-hmm. Right? How's your family? How's your business? Do you know anyone where this is hitting them head on in some way? And we listen. I have advised, encouraged, and practiced to the best of my ability over my career as a leader, and certainly in the fundraising profession, to listen 80% of the time.
Your best salespeople do that. Talk 20, listen 80.
It's universal. Talk about an opportunity here. People want to be heard. Mm-hmm. We always want to be heard, but we're so frantic and busy when things are normal. It's so chaotic. We don't even reflect on the fact that nobody's listening to us, or we're shouting in order to get someone's attention for a moment. But now at this full stop, what do we have? We have people largely confined to their homes. We have people worried about today and tomorrow. We have people fearful and anxious. We have people restless, bored, starved for human interaction. Mm-hmm. And we, representing our organizations, that creates this opportunity to reach out to our relationships and to express our concern and our appreciation for people. They want to talk. They want to talk.
Interesting you bring that up, because I had a conversation with a gentleman yesterday. He sits on the board of directors for a university I'm working with, and he's a pastor. And the conversation that I had with him yesterday, although it was very important that we have from a university perspective, the most important part of that was how he had one of his parishioners had a child who had passed at 4 months old. That is far more important than any consulting work that we were doing together or anything else. And it was just, all I wanted to do was be there for him. Yeah. A principal of a high school told me years ago, and it's something that I have always done my best to bring with me. It's like, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Right. There you go.
And that's the basis for relationships,
That's right.
Which really is, during a crisis, as I'm understanding what you're saying, that is the biggest thing that someone in your area of expertise, development, fundraising, advancement, can do. Build that relationship and maintain the relationship.
And so, and that's why having the long view is so critical, that it's a lifetime relationship for your organization. And it could become a lifetime relationship for you, even after you're no longer with the entity you represent. You never know. But so when we have these moments that are so hard and we listen really closely, people will talk, and oftentimes they're going to disclose things that perhaps they wouldn't ordinarily disclose. And what that does is it deepens trust. Trust is the oil of relationships. You think when you see a breakdown in relationships, trust is at the heart of it every time.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get to build and deepen trust during these times. And that's when we think about the bottom line, dollars and cents. Well, if you want to raise more money for your organization, good times and bad times, create trusting relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And listening is at the heart of it. Now, it's listening with the intent of, by the way, retaining, not in order to set you up for your last 20% to talk. I mean, we have to listen carefully because you need to retain in order to retrieve in the future. I say retain, record, retrieve, because if you really care about someone, and if you're at all like me, when I get off a phone call or a video call with someone, I take notes. And I do that because they may have told me something that really mattered a lot to them. And, 2 months later and, 1,000 conversations in between, I might fail to remember something that they shared with me that was very important and meaningful to them.
Mm-hmm.
So by recording it, then I can retrieve it. So the next time I'm engaged with them, of course, I can ask about what really mattered to them the last time we were engaged. And that, that's technique in one sense, but it's our way of managing this complex world we find ourselves in respectfully. It's about respect.
Yes.
And, what I found in the course of the 25 years of fundraising, this kind of care about other people translates to access. And I'm not just talking about checkbooks at all here. Access in terms of their being willing to listen, being willing to go on calls, being willing to influence on behalf of our organizations, and yes, philanthropy, and oftentimes increasing philanthropy over time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if I might, focusing now on the here and now, listen, those who are involved in raising those largest gifts for an organization, the larger gifts for an organization, much of that work is done face to face. The core of it is done face to face. Well, it's pretty hard to do that now. Who's getting on a plane anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people are nervous about you coming within 6 feet of them. So do what we're doing and get on a video call. And it's not quite the same it's not exactly three-dimensional, but I tell you what's great about video calls is even old guys like me, we know how to use Zoom. We know how to, we can use Skype and FaceTime. If we hadn't learned up until now, if you got a grandkid who's 7, they're teaching you how to use Zoom. And so people are comfortable with video and they're willing to get on video calls. Well, this is so much more powerful when you can have the eye-to-eye, face-to-face contact. And certainly for us in our roles, now we get to see the nonverbals, right? We get to see the furrowing of the brow, the leaning back, the crossing of the arms, the leaning forward, the sparkle in the eye, whatever it might be. We get to see that, and they get to see that also, which is so much more dynamic than a telephone call, although telephone work is very helpful too. So let's seize the moment and maximize the technology most all of us are familiar with, and so are most of our relationships, and get in front of people this way. Most folks will welcome it. And I know of a number of folks I've been talking with they're using video like we all are in order to conduct themselves in their worlds, but they're using it for fundraising purposes. Now, we have to be sensitive to the fact that people have fewer resources or feel like they have fewer resources right now.
That's the key. They feel it.
They feel it. And we have to be willing to work with them. When I think about, like I said, proceeding with a campaign as the Great Recession landed, I mean, it was kind of obvious. Well, people probably aren't going to be able to do what they would have contemplated doing a year before, or at least in the fashion. Someone wouldn't write us a check for $100,000 or $1 million, in January of 2009. But we could have a conversation about $100,000, about $1 million, and talk about time differently, talk about structuring the gift differently. So I think some of the folks that, let's just use the $100,000 number, a year before may have written a check for $100,000, but now we're talking about, maybe $10,000 a year over 10 years. Or for some people, well, I can do $25,000 over 5 years, and the rest I'm going to have to put in my will. Is that okay, Martin? And so, yeah, you'd love to have all $100,000, but the moment didn't allow for it.
And you have to be flexible.
That's right. We have to be flexible. And people are willing to be flexible if we're flexible. Mm-hmm. Because again, their philanthropic disposition hadn't changed. It's just their ability to be responsive had to adjust to the contemporary challenges in which they found themselves.
And of course, in your being flexible, as in the fundraiser being flexible, it brings in more trust into that relationship. You're being empathetic. You understand the situation of the donor, and he or she is going to understand that, feel better, trust you that much more, versus you coming in and saying, we want that 100,000 right now. We have to have it.
Right. Well, you nailed it. I would say another thing is that we can certainly talk about gifts with people now, and not in the sense of packaging the gift, but in the sense of what we represent. So for those who work, as I did for many years at a university or a college, there's usually a variety of areas that can be of interest to a donor. Universities are not a single opportunity. There's a variety, and so it creates an opportunity for us to think about, well, given this context, what might align best with the moment in time? Mm-hmm. So, student emergency funding is very popular right now. Any number of institutions are talking about this need. And other kinds, technology needs, because suddenly the world has changed, and for the foreseeable future, maybe forever, online education is going to be ratcheted up as never before, like we're forced to do, or we've chosen to do, with this current problem. And there are things about our organizations that come to the fore. Student counseling would be another example, and so on, or community services in the sense of how our organizations might be involved in supporting the community. If you're in other kinds of entities, if you're an emergency food provider, you ought to be knocking on everybody's door fearlessly and asking for support, because there's a huge community with a huge need. You look at the television pictures we've seen of cars lined up for miles and people hours and hours sitting in their cars in order to get a bag of food. Where we've come to so quickly and so dramatically, right, Drum?
Yeah, it's very difficult for so many out there, and I think you really nailed it. There are multiple areas that need help, and it's a matter of finding where the donors' feelings are, what they want to do, and the areas of need. Mm-hmm. So I think you've come up with some really good ideas: the relationship, the trust, the areas of need, being flexible in the donations. These are all critical things that people should be thinking about now in the current crisis situation we are when it comes to fundraising. Right. Anything else that comes to mind?
Well, I think those who are fundraisers, like for everyone, this is an educational moment. So fundraisers, you have more time on your hands. Educate. There's lots of websites like your own, the Change Leader. Go to websites where there's trustworthy information and educate yourself. Get on the phone in a Zoom call with your peers and find out what they're doing, how they're thinking, how they're framing and engaging with their support communities, and look for not just encouragement, but perhaps unique ideas that one or the other are implementing that you could transfer directly to what you're doing, or spark something that's fresh for you. So there's a time to education, there's a time to support others. We can't just be thinking of ourselves, but we also have something to give away here. Let's give what knowledge and experience and encouragement we can to those around us. That will certainly be appreciated, and it's certainly a responsibility we have to give further. The other thing would be touching on the personal side of this, and that is it's an opportunity to review yourself and your own values. I mean, this is. I mean, every human being on the planet has this opportunity. Have I been spending my time on the right things? What really matters most, Martin? What really matters most, Drum? And in this kind of situation, it gets clear. It gets clearer.
Mm-hmm.
I think about, to be personal, my family. I have 4 older sisters, a younger brother. The baby is going to be 64 next month. So we're all getting older. My oldest sister becomes 79 next month. And I got us all, there's 6 of us, as I said, I got us all on Zoom. So once a week, we're doing a Zoom family hour, you might say. And some of the in-laws sit in, come and go. But it took us about a month before everybody could just click on the thing and enter into the visit. I mean, we'd spend half the time trying to get somebody,
Sure.
to get on screen or to get their voice working. I mean, it got to be laughable. But even now my soon-to-be 79-year-old sister feels comfortable on Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, why did we readily agree to this? Because, we live we all live apart from one another, right? With this current sheltering in place and all. But the unsaid thing was, we don't know what tomorrow brings. And we matter to one another. We love one another. And so this is a way, no matter what happens, we can express our appreciation and affection and respect for one another by spending time, for what it is, right, through a Zoom call.
Very much so, yeah.
And, I come from a great family, Drum. I'm so fortunate and blessed. And, we're laughing through half of it, telling stories, poking fun at each other. Yeah. And if something unfortunate happens, one or more of us were to contract the virus, or the virus wins a battle or two in our family, we'll look back on these engagements and say, we focused on what mattered most, which was one another.
Absolutely. And that is the crux of an outstanding fundraiser, a development officer, is focusing on what's important to others.
That's right.
So three things that folks should be doing right now from a fundraising perspective, looking at what's going on now versus what potentially is going to be going on in 6 to 9 months.
Well, as I said, don't stop. Communicate, communicate, communicate. I mean, there's the 3 things right there, right? Find out how people are doing, educate them about your circumstances as appropriate, ask them questions about what insight and advice they might have given the problems and challenges you have in your role as a college or university president and chancellor and so on. You'll be surprised at the insights that they'll have for you. Think about the relationship long term, that what you're doing is you're building for the future, always with a relationship. Don't be afraid to talk about resources, but you talk about resources with a sensitivity And by listening first, a context for whether it's appropriate to talk about support at this point in time with this particular person or people or organization you're in front of. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's 3 or not, but
well, that's more than 3, but frankly, every one of those is critical. So thank you. So Martin, what's next for you? You've been somewhat enjoying your retirement, but knowing you as I do, you're not retired.
Well, there's 2 things going on in my life. There's the outward, and that's author, coach, consultant, and speaker. Mm-hmm. And then there's the inward. And the inward is perhaps less describable. It's about becoming the best person I can be with the time I have left and being able to be the best kind of person for others that I can be, whoever the others might be around me, recognizing every moment as the moment.
Being completely present in the moment.
Trying to be present, and finding my stillness. I have more time now that I'm retired. I've lengthened my morning rituals substantially in order to try to go deeper. But yeah, on the other side of it, doing a little writing, doing weekly videos on fundraising mostly now, and doing a lot of podcasts, like what we're doing, Drum. This has been my over a quarter now of podcasts. I've gotten into these podcasts, and lots of people want to talk about this subject. And what's great about podcasting, of course, is I couldn't get on a plane if I wanted to go speak, and somebody wouldn't have me speak now if they wanted me to. But, here I could be in my pajamas for all you know, Drum, and
oh no, I could see you, Martin. That's not going to work. Oh, I do have to tell you. Then we're going to have to wrap up. Yeah. I was doing a conference call with a few colleagues, and one of the gents came on, and literally he was in his bathrobe and very quickly turned off the video. It was priceless.
Well, I saw something in the newspaper about some judge complaining that who was holding court through Zoom of all these attorneys, inappropriately dressed. So yeah, we if we're about professional matters, we should still look appropriate, at least business casual, for goodness sake. But
this is true.
Yeah, it's my opinion.
My friend, it's great seeing you again, and certainly have enjoyed our time together.
Yeah, Trom, it's a pleasure. Good to see you, sir, and thank you for this opportunity, and I hope your audience has helped.
I'm sure it will. Thank you again, and take care, my brother.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Martin Leifeld, fundraiser extraordinaire, and for his sharing with us thoughts on fundraising during the coronavirus crisis. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Blackbaud. Visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn about their cloud fundraising, accounting, education management, scholarship, and analytics solutions that are powering some of higher ed's top institutions. We're going to do things a bit differently in our next podcast. We're going to have 2 guests, Tim Hill, CEO of Blackbaud Higher Education Solutions, and Scott Roberts, president of the University of Connecticut's Foundation. Tim and Scott will be joining us to discuss how higher ed fundraising has changed with coronavirus and what they were doing to keep their institutions afloat and sustainable.
This episode of Changing Higher Ed was brought to you by Blackbaud, the world's leading cloud software company powering social good. Be sure to visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn how they can help your institution deliver a better experience from admissions to advancement. Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show. We would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.